They called her Theodora of the perfumed tomb, the last daughter of a dying Byzantine dynasty. Her name was erased from chronicles, her likeness scraped from church walls. Yet buried in forbidden records lies a love story so blasphemous, the empire itself tried to destroy it. This is not legend, but a tragedy buried by the crown. A princess raised in gold, who would one day kneel before the blade of the man she loved, her own executioner. In the final years of Emperor Michael IV's reign, Constantinople glittered like a jeweled corpse, magnificent, perfumed, and quietly rotting. From the outside, the empire still proclaimed its divine strength. Its saints painted on every wall, its rulers hailed as chosen by God. But within the palace, the air was thick with incense and deceit. And beneath the marble floors lay chambers where truth was strangled in silence. Princess Theodora was born into this perfumed decay. Her cradle was carved from cedar, her sheets spun from Syrian silk, and her lullabies were sung by slaves who feared to meet her eyes. From infancy, she was told that she was purity incarnate, that her hands must never touch common dust, that her voice must echo only in prayer. But even as a child, Theodora sensed something hollow beneath the prayers that filled her father's court. The hymns sounded like mourning songs. The laughter of courtiers resembled the cries of the condemned. Her mother, Empress Zoe, once the most adored woman of Byzantium, had become a shadow of herself. The poison of politics had seeped into her veins long before the real poison would claim her body. Every banquet became a theater of suspicion. Cups were switched, tasters fell ill, and eyes lingered too long on silver goblets. Theodora, barely 11, learned to recognize deceit not by words, but by the trembling of hands that held the wine. It was at one such banquet, under the flicker of oil lamps and the heavy scent of myrrh, that Theodora's innocence ended. Her mother lifted a jeweled cup and smiled through the painted veil of courtly serenity. Moments later, the Empress's hand began to shake. The smile remained, frozen and wrong, as her body arched and trembled. The courtiers did not scream. They simply lowered their eyes and waited for the emperor's nod. Michael IV said nothing. His expression was carved in stone. When the empress collapsed, her golden veil slipping to reveal blood upon her lips, servants carried her away in silence. The feast resumed as if nothing had happened. Theodora sat frozen, her small hands clutching her mother's cup, the scent of spiced wine burning her throat. That night, the princess wandered through the silent corridors of the palace. The icons on the walls glimmered faintly, their painted eyes following her. Somewhere beyond the great doors, she heard muffled cries, not the cries of grief, but of punishment. It was said the emperor demanded confessions even from the dying. Theodora pressed her ear against the marble and listened to the sound of a man's prayer, ending in a scream. From her balcony, she could see the Bosporus glittering in the moonlight, calm, beautiful, indifferent. Below her, the imperial city dreamed of holiness, while its rulers drowned in sin. She would never see her mother again. No tomb was built, no ceremony permitted. Only a faint scent of jasmine lingered in the empress's empty chamber, as if her memory itself had been suffocated by order of the throne. Years later, when Theodora was old enough to understand, she would realize the truth. Her mother's death had been arranged not by enemies of the crown, but by the crown itself. And the empire that called itself eternal was already dying from within its perfumed tomb. Years passed, yet the palace still smelled of her mother's death, a faint trace of jasmine beneath the incense smoke that filled every corridor. Princess Theodora grew into a solemn young woman, her beauty spoken of as divine, though her eyes betrayed a quiet dread. After the empress's mysterious end, Emperor Michael turned her upbringing over to the church, declaring that his daughter would be a bride of Christ before she becomes a bride of the empire. Thus, her world shrank to a cloistered wing of Hagia Sophia, a labyrinth of candles, prayer, and endless silence. Monks and nuns whispered as she passed. They bowed, but none dared to meet her gaze. Each morning, she knelt before golden icons of saints whose eyes seemed carved from judgment itself. She was taught that every human desire was a path to ruin. Even laughter was discouraged, for joy invites the devil, her confessor would murmur. Theodora obeyed, outwardly perfect, but within her grew a cold rebellion, a yearning to feel something unpermitted. Her dreams became filled with disjointed visions, her mother's lips stained red, the flicker of torches underground, the echo of unseen weeping. At times, she would wake to find her hands trembling as though she had touched something unholy. It was during one of her confessions that she first saw him. The small chapel beneath the cathedral was dim, lit only by the glow of oil lamps and a single shaft of morning light that fell upon the priest's chair. As Theodora whispered her sins, she sensed another presence in the shadows behind the screen, silent, still, watching. When she turned, she saw him for the first time, Cassian, the young apprentice to the palace executioner. He was kneeling near the altar, cleaning the floor with rags soaked in ash and vinegar, the punishment of his station. His clothes were rough and dark, his face partly hidden by his hood, but his eyes, they were hollow and alive all at once. They met hers only for a breath, yet it was enough. She had never seen a man's eyes look upon her without worship or fear. Cassian's gaze held neither. It held knowledge, the knowledge of death. When the priest dismissed her, Theodora lingered, pretending to pray. She watched as Cassian wiped the marble where penitents had bled during their punishments. There was reverence in his movements, as though he were cleaning not filth, but memory. When he rose, she caught sight of a faint scar across his neck, the mark of a rope burn, healed long ago. That night, she could not sleep. The candles in her chamber flickered like restless souls, and the icons on her walls seemed to shift in the dim light. She remembered the scar, the silent obedience, the weight of his stare. She told herself it was pity, pity for a man condemned to serve death, yet her heart betrayed her, beating with a rhythm foreign to prayer. Weeks passed, and she saw him again, always in the periphery of her world, carrying chains for the penitents, lighting the censers before executions, standing wordless beside her father during public punishments. Every encounter left her both terrified and enthralled. By now she had stopped praying for purity. She prayed only that God would never let her see those eyes again, for she feared that if she did, she would never look away. And so began the first tremor in a love that would one day shake the empire to its foundations. Cassian had no memory of his birth, only of the dungeon walls that raised him. His earliest lullabies were the echo of chains, his first lessons the ritual of killing in silence. In Byzantium, executioners were not men but instruments, consecrated tools of divine justice. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to speak of their work, and forbidden to look upon the faces of the royal blood they served. To ensure obedience, each boy chosen for the post was broken in spirit before he reached manhood. Cassian's father had once been a condemned soldier, executed for defying an imperial command. The child was spared, not out of mercy, but for usefulness. The boy was taken into the palace of Blachernay and trained by the proto-cantorchos Tundelian, the chief of the imperial executioners. It was a form of priesthood, of death rather than faith. Before every punishment, they were made to kneel before icons and recite psalms, that the taking of a life might appear a holy act rather than a duty of fear. As Cassian grew, his soul hardened. He learned to slice, to dismember, to burn without trembling. Every command was obedience, every hesitation a sin. Yet even obedience came at a cost. The first time he severed a head, he wept afterward, not for the man he killed, but for the warmth that left his own heart. His master had found him that night and struck him until his tears ceased. "We serve the emperor," the old man hissed. "And the emperor serves God. Your pity is rebellion." Years of ritual followed. The mask became his face, the sword his faith. His life was confined to the darkness beneath the palace, the chamber of penance, where condemned nobles met their end. Candles burned endlessly there, their wax melted into a pool that never cooled. He slept beside the corpses until the smell no longer stirred disgust. When other boys were taught scripture, Cassian learned anatomy, where to strike, how to make death swift or slow according to decree. But even the dead left whispers behind. In the silence between executions, he began to hear the faint echoes of prayers, not from the living, but from those he had slain. He wondered if their souls clung to him, drawn to the hands that delivered them to judgment. Sometimes he thought he saw their faces flicker in the steel of his blade. Then came the day he met her. Princess Theodora, pure, distant, untouchable. She had looked at him once, and in that single moment, something shifted. No prayer or ritual could wash away the memory of her gaze. It haunted him in the hours between dawn and duty. When he lifted his sword, he saw her reflection in the blood. He began to falter. Small acts of hesitation, a heartbeat's delay, a softened strike. The chief executioner noticed. "You pray too long," the man said one night. "The soul you pity will one day be your own." But pity had already turned into something else, something both forbidden and sacred. For the first time in his life, Cassian disobeyed an order. He refused to execute a prisoner until the emperor himself confirmed the guilt. It was treason in silence, rebellion in thought. And though no one saw his defiance, the empire would feel its tremor soon enough. For mercy, once awakened in a killer, never dies quietly. There were parts of the imperial palace forbidden even to royalty, corridors that did not appear on maps, doors without guards, and stairways that descended into silence. Theodora had been told since childhood that the palace was a holy place, a reflection of heaven's order. But in Byzantium, heaven had cellars. The discovery came by accident. One night, unable to sleep, Theodora followed the sound of faint murmurs echoing through a side passage of her father's hall. The air there was colder, thick with the scent of rust and incense. She carried a lamp beneath her veil and descended the steps alone. Beneath the marble floors of the palace, she found an iron door carved with a single word, logoi, the words. When she entered, she realized the name was irony. For inside that chamber, there were no words at all. It was a vault of silence. Torches burned low along the walls, revealing benches stained dark with old blood. Chains dangled from hooks. On the floor lay tools that glimmered like relics, knives shaped like crosses, tongs etched with prayers. And beside the altar stood Cassian. He was bareheaded now, his mask resting on the stone beside him. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he washed a blade in a basin of wine. At his feet knelt a man whose mouth had been bound with linen, crimson seeping through the cloth. Cassian moved like a priest performing a sacrament, careful, reverent, his lips murmuring the psalms he had been taught since childhood. Theodora froze. She knew this man, a senator once loyal to her mother, accused of conspiracy weeks before. So this was where loyalty came to die. When Cassian turned, their eyes met once more. For an instant, she thought he would call for guards, but instead he bowed his head, silent, waiting for her command. The weight of the moment crushed her. This was not defiance. It was surrender. A man who had been taught to obey now awaited her word, and she had no words to give. The senator fell still soon after. Theodora watched as Cassian cut away the bandages from the dead man's mouth. Where there should have been a tongue, there was only a wound. "The emperor," Cassian whispered at last, breaking the silence, "orders the tongue removed from those who speak against him, so their silence may please God." Theodora's lamp flickered. Her throat closed, but she could not turn away. It was then she understood the empire's perfection was built upon mutilated prayers, that every hymn of glory sung in the Hagia Sophia was echoed by a whisper of agony below the palace. She stepped closer. Cassian did not move. His eyes held neither pride nor shame, only weariness, the kind that no confession could wash away. Theodora reached out, hesitating, and let her fingertips brush the iron chain still hanging from the wall. It was warm from the man's final breath. That touch awakened something neither holy nor sinful, but entirely human, a shared understanding between the pure and the damned. She left the chamber before dawn, her hands trembling, her heart burning with a fever that prayer could not extinguish. From that night onward, she would listen for the muffled cries that rose from beneath the marble floors, not in fear, but in longing. For every whisper of pain reminded her that he was still there. And though she could not name it yet, her fascination with the executioner had begun to eclipse her fear of God. Theodora's palace learned to breathe in whispers. The senators bowed lower. The priests spoke softer. Even the peacocks in the garden seemed to sense the unease that clung to the marble like perfume. Something inside the empire was breaking, and it began, as always, with love disguised as loyalty. The failed coup started at dawn. Smoke rose from the southern gate where the banners of disloyal families burned. The conspirators had promised freedom from the emperor's decrees, a return to virtue and mercy. But in Byzantium, mercy was treason. The rebellion ended before the bells of the basilica had finished tolling. When the captured men were dragged before the throne, Theodora sat beside her father, her hands folded like a statue's. The emperor's expression was calm, too calm, as he read the names of the condemned. Among them was one that struck her heart like a blade, Nestor of Antioch. She remembered Nestor from childhood, a quiet man who had once laughed softly with her nurse in the garden. He had been gentle, carrying honey cakes and stories from distant wars. To her, he had been proof that kindness could survive in a world of iron. Now he knelt in chains, his hair matted, his eyes wild with faith and fear. "Let the executioner come forth," the emperor commanded. Cassian entered in silence. His steps were measured, his eyes fixed not on the prisoner, but on the floor, a ritual of humility he had long perfected. Theodora's breath caught as he drew his sword, the same blade that gleamed like a promise in the chamber below. The emperor gestured for the trial to end. "He who speaks against the crown speaks against heaven. Let heaven judge him." Cassian raised the sword. For a heartbeat, the hall became utterly still, the kind of silence that lives only before death. Then the blade fell. The sound was neither scream nor cry, only the dull certainty of a life ending as duty required. Nestor's head rolled forward, stopping at the hem of Theodora's gown. Blood spread across the white marble, dark and warm, seeping toward her shoes. She did not move. When Cassian turned to bow before the throne, his hand, still slick with blood, brushed against the floor near her. Without thinking, Theodora reached down and touched him. Just once. It was not a gesture of defiance nor pity. It was something deeper, a communion between two souls marked by the same wound. Her fingertips grazed the crimson on his skin. The warmth shot through her like a prayer denied. Cassian froze. For the first time, his composure broke. His eyes lifted, meeting hers with something raw, almost terrified. He withdrew his hand slowly, as though afraid the world would end if he touched her again. The emperor did not see. The court did not notice. But something irreversible had begun. That night, Theodora could still feel the pulse of his hand beneath her fingers. She washed them until her skin burned, yet the scent of iron remained. In her dreams, she saw Cassian not as executioner, but as man, alone, burdened, and beautiful in his ruin. When dawn came, she knelt before the altar, whispering a confession she could not finish. "Forgive me," she prayed, though she did not know whether she sought forgiveness from God or from the man she had damned by touch. For in that single moment, when a princess touched a murderer's hand, both their fates were sealed. Theodora had given her heart to the man who killed for her father, and Cassian had found something purer than obedience, the curse of love. By the time winter came, the palace had forgotten Nestor's name, but Theodora had not. His blood had left a stain beneath the throne, faint and brown, that no servant dared to scrub away. It was as if the marble itself had remembered the rebellion. Her father, the emperor, spoke little of it, yet his silences grew longer and his prayers louder. He began to summon priests to dine with him at dawn and discuss virtue over wine. Theodora, seated at his right, felt the sermons growing sharper, each word a blade wrapped in scripture. When he looked at her, it was no longer with the affection of a father, but with the suspicion of a ruler. The court whispered that his daughter had grown too devout, her beauty too contemplative, her eyes filled with thoughts that belonged only to monks and poets. In Byzantium, a woman's piety could be mistaken for pride, and pride was sin. The feast of St. Basil was meant to cleanse that sin. The night began in splendor. Golden draperies hung from the ceilings, and the air was heavy with the scent of myrrh and roasted lamb. Bishops from every province gathered beneath the crystal lamps, their vestments shining like a sea of fire. Theodora stood among them, her white gown a symbol of purity, though she could feel her father's gaze pierce through every thread. Cassian was there too, standing at the edge of the hall with the other guards. He was dressed in ceremonial armor, the executioner's sword sheathed beneath his cloak. His presence burned at the edge of her vision like forbidden light. When the emperor rose to speak, silence swept the feast. "My daughter," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "has lived beneath the shadow of temptation. It is the duty of a ruler not only to guard the empire's borders, but the purity of his own blood." Theodora's heart stilled. The bishops nodded gravely. Her father gestured to the dais before the altar. "Kneel, child. Let the Lord witness your repentance." She obeyed, her knees pressing into the cold marble. A priest approached, carrying a small iron brand shaped like a cross. Theodora's breath trembled as the metal was heated over the flame. She glanced toward the shadows. Cassian was watching, his jaw set, his hands clenched tight at his sides. The priest raised the brand, murmuring, "The mark of temptation shall guard her soul from sin." When the iron touched her shoulder, the pain tore through her like fire beneath ice. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Smoke rose, sharp and holy, curling like incense toward the dome. Cassian took a step forward, just one, before catching himself. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes glistened in the candlelight. The emperor crossed himself and turned away. "Virtue restored," he declared. The court applauded. But Theodora did not move. Beneath the brand's burn, she felt not shame but awakening. The mark was no longer her father's victory. It was the seal of her defiance, proof that she could endure what heaven demanded. When the feast ended and the torches dimmed, Cassian lingered by the door. Their eyes met for only a breath, but in that silence he understood. The brand upon her skin was not a warning. It was a calling. And soon, the fire it began would consume them both. The emperor's sermons no longer satisfied his suspicion. He wanted proof that his daughter's heart was not corrupted. And so, on the cold morning after the feast of St. Basil, Theodora was exiled from the palace under the guise of spiritual purification. Her destination was the monastery of St. Euthymius, a fortress of stone carved into the cliffs beyond the Bosporus. Officially, it was a convent devoted to prayer and silence. In truth, it was where the empire buried its political wounds, widowed nobles, fallen courtiers, and women whose bloodlines embarrassed the throne. Theodora was given no attendants, no jewelry, not even a mirror. Her silk was exchanged for coarse wool. She slept on straw and woke to the tolling bell that summoned the condemned to prayer. But even in her isolation, she carried within her the ember of defiance that the brand had not extinguished. Nights were the hardest. The winds that swept through the monastery carried whispers, fragments of confession, moans from the dungeons below, and the clang of distant chains. The sisters said the lower vaults were forbidden, for there the church housed those awaiting God's verdict. One night, drawn by a sound she could not name, Theodora followed the echo down the spiral stair. The air grew colder, the walls slick with salt. The corridor opened into the catacombs, where candlelight trembled upon hundreds of chained figures. And among them Cassian. He stood in armor blackened by ash, a torch in one hand, the sword of penance in the other. His face was thinner, older, but his eyes, those same haunted eyes, recognized her at once. "Theodora," he whispered, as though saying her name were a sin. She stepped closer, unable to breathe. "Why are you here?" "To cleanse," he said bitterly. "The Emperor sends his faithful to slaughter the heretics. He believes blood can restore the Empire's holiness." A prisoner moaned nearby. Cassian turned away, his jaw trembling. Theodora reached for him, her fingers brushing the edge of his gauntlet. "Then cleanse me," she said softly. "If prayer is not enough, let my blood join theirs." He flinched, but she pressed his hand to her throat, the same hand that had ended so many lives. The iron was cold, but her skin burned beneath it. "Do not tempt me," he said. "Then pray with me," she replied. And there, in the shadow of the altar's foundation, they knelt together. Their prayers were whispers, broken by tears. When his hand slipped from the hilt to hers, the act felt less like sin and more like absolution. Two souls chained by the same crown, seeking mercy no scripture could give. The nights that followed became their ritual. When the sisters slept, Theodora descended to the catacombs. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they said nothing. Once she cut her palm and pressed it against his, a bond sealed not by lips but by blood. But love in Byzantium was never secret for long. Rumors spread among the monks, a princess who prayed beneath the altar with the man who carried the sword of execution. Whispers reached the capital like the hiss of a viper. And when the emperor heard, he did not rage. He only smiled, the thin, calm smile of a man preparing a spectacle. For in Byzantium, mercy was never given. It was staged. When the news reached Constantinople, the emperor did not shout. He simply closed his psalter, dismissed the priest, and stared long into the brazier beside his throne, as if waiting for the fire to speak. His daughter, the symbol of divine purity, had been found kneeling beside the executioner, a man born of condemned blood. For Michael IV, it was not merely sin. It was treason of the soul. He summoned his court and read aloud a new decree. Let every vessel that holds impurity be broken before it poisons the chalice of the empire. No one dared to ask what he meant. Days later, Cassian was seized in the monastery. They took him without resistance. His sword was snapped before him, its fragments cast into the Bosporus. Bound in chains, he was paraded through the streets, a silent symbol of what happens when obedience defies divinity. The people spat and crossed themselves. Mothers turned their children's faces away. Yet, among the whispers, some pitied him, for even the executioner, they said, could not choose who he was commanded to love. Theodora was dragged back to the capital at dawn. Her garments were torn. Her hair, once perfumed and adorned with pearls, hung like a shroud. She was placed in the chapel where her mother had once prayed for mercy that never came. When the emperor entered, incense filled the air, thick, suffocating. "My daughter," he said, his tone gentle, almost fatherly. "Do you understand what you've done?" Theodora raised her head. Her lips were pale but steady. "Yes, father. I've loved where you forbade it." "Love?" He smiled. "No, child. You have been bewitched by the darkness he carries. That man's hands have spilled noble blood. He has killed priests, scholars, men of God." She did not look away. And yet those same hands trembled when they touched mine. The silence that followed was unbearable. Michael IV rose, his patience dissolving like wax. Then you leave me no choice. For the salvation of your soul, and the preservation of this throne, you will watch as your corrupter is purified. Cassian's punishment was decreed that night. His tongue was to be torn from his mouth so he could no longer speak her name. His eyes were to be burned with incense ash, the same incense used to sanctify the emperor's own crown. The sentence was to be performed at dawn. But Byzantium's walls had ears and hearts that still remembered compassion. A palace servant slipped word to Theodora before the first bell. She did not flee. Instead, she walked barefoot into the courtyard, where soldiers gathered around the stake. Cassian knelt before them, head bowed, his wrists bound in iron. "Stop!" Her voice echoed through the colonnades, and for a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. Theodora fell to her knees beside him. "If he is guilty," she cried, "then so am I. I have loved him, not as a princess, but as a soul." Gasps rippled through the assembly. The emperor's face turned to marble. "Let it be written," he said coldly, "that my daughter confesses her blasphemy before God and empire alike." Cassian tried to speak, but only blood answered him. Theodora took his shaking hand, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "We are one sin." The soldiers moved forward. And in that instant, as the emperor's decree was sealed, the empire trembled, not because a law had been broken, but because for the first time, love had defied the sword. The trial was never meant for justice. It was theater, a ritual to cleanse the imperial name. By dawn, the Hagia Sophia had been emptied of its worshippers and filled with courtiers, bishops, and scribes. The banners of the cross and the empire hung side by side, fluttering above an altar now turned into a judgment seat. At its center stood Theodora, no longer in silks, but in a rough tunic the color of dust. Her wrists were chained, though the links were light enough to keep up appearances of mercy. Cassian was brought beside her, kneeling, head bowed. His tongue was gone. Only a red scar remained where his words had once lived. The crowd murmured prayers and insults alike. "Behold," said Patriarch Menes, raising his jeweled staff, "the serpent who defiled the house of the Lord." A bishop stepped forward, holding a parchment. "The princess," he read, "stands accused of fornication, heresy, and consorting with a vessel of unclean blood, the imperial executioner Cassian, who served under the seal of the throne." Theodora's voice did not waver. "If love is heresy," she said, "then the empire was founded on sin. For your emperors have always worshipped power, not God." A gasp ran through the chamber. Michael IV did not rise. He simply watched, his eyes fixed upon his daughter as if he were already carving her name from memory. A priest stepped forward, holding a chalice filled with oil. "Speak, daughter of the empire," he said. "Repent, and your soul may yet be cleansed." Cassian tried to move toward her, but two guards pinned him down. His muffled cry broke through the hush, the guttural sound of a man who could no longer shape words. Theodora looked at him, tears filling her eyes. "You see," she said softly, "even silence speaks louder than the emperor's truth." The court erupted in outrage. Bishops struck their staffs upon the marble. The patriarch thundered, "Silence her! She blasphemes!" But before they could drag her away, she turned toward the gathering of priests and courtiers. "You cut tongues, you burn eyes, and you call it faith," she said. "You poison your own daughters and pray over their corpses. You call this empire holy, but it was built on the screams you buried beneath your altars." Menes lifted the cross high. "Enough, you are possessed by the devil himself." She smiled faintly, her chains clinking like distant bells. "Then let the devil love as purely as I have." The words hung in the air, heavier than the incense. The patriarch declared the verdict. The princess shall be stripped of all royal honors and confined until death. Cassian shall be executed for treason against the divine crown." Guards tore the thin circlet from her head, its metal biting into her hair. As it fell to the floor, Cassian looked up, eyes hollow, desperate, and for the first time, she saw him weep. No sound left him, only tears streaking through ash. He tried to touch her, but the chains held him back. Their eyes met, one final communion before the empire tore them apart. The crowd began to laugh, not with joy, but with the cruel relief of those spared from guilt. And in that vast hall, filled with gold, crosses, and hypocrisy, two souls, one voiceless, one condemned, found a silence more sacred than the empire's prayers. By the emperor's command, the courtyard of execution was prepared, not for rebels or thieves, but for his own blood. Theodora's fate was to become a spectacle, a sermon carved in flesh. It would be held in the Garden of Thorns, the inner palace courtyard where the corpses of traitors once fed the emperor's sacred peacocks. Marble columns encircled the place like witnesses to centuries of cruelty. At its center stood the iron scaffold, freshly washed, as if purity could be restored with water alone. On every balcony, nobles gathered behind silk veils to watch the emperor's justice unfold. Cassian was brought forth at dawn. His body bore the marks of torture, his tongue already gone, his sight dimmed by burns. Yet he was dressed again in the black robes of the executioner, a grim resurrection for one final act of obedience. Theodora stood across from him, her wrists bound in linen, her head bare. She looked not like a prisoner, but like a saint preparing for martyrdom. Even the guards hesitated when they saw her calm face. The emperor descended from the gallery, holding a golden cross. "Today," he declared, "the empire cleanses itself of its last impurity. Let this garden bear witness to divine order restored." His words drifted like smoke, hollow and rehearsed. Cassian's sword was placed in his trembling hands. He looked at it, the same blade that had served emperors for generations. The steel shimmered faintly in the morning light, a reflection of the sky that neither he nor Theodora would ever see again. Theodora's gaze met his. There was no fear, only recognition, the quiet acceptance of two souls bound by the same wound. She took a small step forward, her chains whispering against the stone. "You have always served death," she said softly. "But today, serve love." Cassian shook his head, tears welling in his sightless eyes. His fingers tightened on the hilt as if it burned him. The crowd murmured, restless. Priests began to chant hymns, drowning the silence with pious noise. The emperor raised his hand. "Do your duty." Cassian dropped to his knees, the sword slipping from his grasp. A soldier struck him across the face, forcing him upright. Theodora turned toward the sky. "Father," she said, "you taught me that purity is obedience. But there is no obedience without mercy." Her words hung in the still air, an open defiance. The emperor's face turned to stone. He gestured again, his jaw tight. Cassian reached for the blade once more. His hand trembled violently. He could feel her breath before him, calm, steady, forgiving. She did not move away. "I forgive you," she whispered. And then silence. No cry, no plea. Only the sound of the sword slicing through air, followed by the soft collapse of silk upon marble. Theodora fell as if in prayer. Cassian caught her before she touched the ground, cradling her body against his chest. Blood soaked through his robe, marking him with a crimson cross. For a moment, even the emperor could not speak. The peacock screamed, a terrible echoing sound that filled the courtyard. The priests declared it done. The empire applauded its own righteousness. But to those who looked closely, the executioner's face was not that of a servant fulfilling command. It was the face of a man whose soul had just been severed. And as the garden fell silent, the scent of blood mixed with the perfume of roses, the last rebellion of beauty against cruelty. The moment Theodora's body fell, the empire exhaled not in grief, but in relief. The execution had been completed, the scandal silenced. The emperor turned from the courtyard before her blood had cooled, believing that divine order had finally been restored. But those who stayed, the guards, the servants, the trembling acolytes, saw something the emperor never did. As Cassian knelt beside her, the dying light caught her face. Her lips were curved, faintly, impossibly, into a smile. It was not mockery nor madness. It was a kind of peace that no punishment could erase. Her eyes, still half open, reflected the sky's pale gold, as if she were watching something only she could see. Cassian's hands were soaked in her blood. It ran down his wrists, over his scars, and across his chest, forming a perfect cross. He did not move. The priests called it a divine sign, a mark of penance. But Cassian knew it was something else. It was her. When the guards came to take her body, he refused to release it. It took 4 men to pry her from his arms. They dragged him away in chains once again, and his silence, the silence of a man who had nothing left to say, terrified even his captors. The executioners burned the linens, washed the marble, and scattered herbs to drown the scent of death. Yet by nightfall, the fragrance returned, not of rot, but of myrrh and roses. The garden of thorns seemed to breathe again, as though life itself had refused to leave the place where she died. By morning, whispers had spread through the palace corridors. The peacocks would not eat. The fountain water ran red before dawn, though no wound could be found. Servants swore they heard a woman's voice singing softly among the hedges, a lullaby older than any hymn. The emperor dismissed it all as superstition. He forbade anyone from speaking Theodora's name, threatening death to those who dared remember. But silence only feeds legend. Soon, they called her the princess who loved her killer. They said her ghost walked the garden each night, her white gown glowing in the moonlight. She would pause beside the scaffold and kneel, touching the stones where Cassian's tears had fallen. Then she would move to the thorn bushes where the first blood had spilled, and rest her hands upon the flowers that grew there. Roses, pale, fragrant, untamed. Some said she smiled when she found them, as if greeting her own creation. Others claimed she whispered to the thorns, calling them by name, the way a mother calls her children. Cassian, locked deep within the palace dungeons, heard these rumors through the cracks in the stone. At night, he would press his head to the wall, hoping to catch her song. The silence between the stones became his only companion. He prayed, not for forgiveness, but for reunion. The emperor ordered her remains hidden. Her body was entombed beneath the garden itself, sealed without a name. Yet even then, flowers kept blooming from the soil, as if her blood remembered sunlight. Years later, the courtiers avoided that courtyard altogether. They said the air there was too still, too watchful. When the wind passed through the hedges, it sounded like breath. And sometimes, just before dawn, a single peacock would cry, spreading its feathers in mourning. The light would strike its plumage, and for an instant, a reflection appeared on the marble floor, the faint outline of a woman's smile, drawn in the color of dawn. It was then that they began to understand. Some love stories end not in life, but in the haunting that follows. The emperor's first decree after Theodora's death was silence. Her name was struck from the records, her portraits burned, her possessions distributed among the priests as holy spoils. The court chroniclers were ordered to erase her from every scroll, to fill her absence with fabricated virtue. Officially, there had never been a princess named Theodora, only a sinner whose existence had offended heaven. Cassian was not executed. Death, the emperor decreed, was too merciful. Instead, he was returned to the dungeons beneath the palace, the same place where he had once prayed for her life. His tongue was torn out to ensure eternal obedience, his voice extinguished as if love itself could be silenced. The guards feared him. They said that even without words, he whispered her name through the dark, that the stones themselves remembered the sound. In the wet silence of the underground, he carved her face into the wall with broken nails, tracing her features again and again until the cuts on his fingers no longer bled. Above him, the empire continued its theater of sanctity. The emperor sponsored new temples, new idols, new decrees to glorify divine justice, all built over the grave of his own guilt. But the people remembered differently. In whispers and secret hymns, they still spoke of the princess who had loved her killer. The Garden of Thorns became forbidden ground. Guards were posted to keep the curious away, but by night, pilgrims crept through the hedges, bringing candles and rose petals. They swore that the air shimmered with a faint perfume, not decay, but the scent of myrrh, of devotion preserved by death. Seasons passed. The emperor aged. His triumph faded into paranoia. At night, he dreamt of the execution, the slow fall of the sword, the moment before her smile. He awoke screaming, certain that someone was watching him through the mirror. Servants claimed he would whisper to his reflection, "She forgave me." Cassian's body weakened, but his memory never dimmed. In the damp blackness of his cell, he began to hear footsteps, soft, bare, unmistakable. When he looked toward the corner, light would flicker, and for a moment, he would see her, the same calm eyes, the same faint smile. He could not speak her name, yet his tears did it for him. One winter night, the emperor finally died, choking on incense smoke during a mass meant to sanctify his reign. His death was declared divine judgment. In the chaos that followed, the palace was abandoned for a decade. Dust gathered where gold once glittered. Centuries turned. Dynasties rose, languages changed. The empire itself became a story. The palace decayed, its gardens reclaimed by silence. And then, one spring morning, a group of monks arrived to restore what remained. Beneath the collapsed chapel, they uncovered a hidden passage, the stones sealed with wax and prayer. Inside, by the faint light of their torches, they found a mural. It had survived untouched by time, painted in pigments made of crushed flowers and ash. It depicted a woman, veiled, serene, kissing the blade that killed her. At her feet knelt a man, faceless, holding the sword as if it were an offering. The monks could not identify the figures. The inscription below had been scratched away centuries ago. But the oldest among them murmured that it felt like truth, something too human for a myth, too painful to be invention. They sealed the chamber again, marking the wall with a single word, Pax, peace. And so history ended where love had been silenced, in a forgotten tomb. Beneath a ruined empire, where two souls defied oblivion not through memory, but through the persistence of their sin. Some say that when the moonlight enters the cracks of that chamber, the mural glows, her lips brushing the steel, her eyes open once more, as if the story of Theodora and Cassian had never ended. Only hidden, only buried by the crown.